The thunder rolled across the vast Montana sky as Florence Delaney huddled beneath a rain-soaked awning, her threadbare coat offering little protection against the sudden summer storm. The year was 1883, and she had nowhere to go not anymore. The stagecoach that had brought her to this small frontier town of Willow Creek had departed hours ago, taking with it her last connection to a life she was desperately trying to forget. Her fingers trembled as she clutched her single bag of possessions. 22 years old and completely alone, Florence had been running for so long she scarcely remembered what it felt like to stay in one place. The orphanage, the series of homes where she'd worked as a maid, the brief marriage to a man who'd turned out to be as cruel as he was charming none had provided what she'd always yearned for. "Miss, you'll catch your death standing out here," came a deep voice from her left. Florence turned to find a tall man watching her from beneath the brim of a weather-beaten Stetson. His face was tanned from years under the sun, with a strong jaw shadowed by stubble. Unlike the dandies from the East, he wore no fancy vest or polished boots, just practical riding clothes covered in trail dust. His eyes, though, caught her attention immediately, kind eyes, the color of the sky just before dusk. "I'm fine," she replied stiffly, pride being the one thing she had left in abundance. "Suit yourself," he said with a slight shrug, "but the silver dollars got hot food and a fire, storms not letting up anytime soon." He gestured to the saloon across the muddy street before tipping his hat and heading in that direction. Florence watched him go, warring with herself. Her stomach chose that moment to growl loudly, reminding her she hadn't eaten since yesterday. With a sigh of resignation, she gathered her courage and followed the stranger's path. The silver dollar was mercifully quiet this early in the evening. A few men sat playing cards, while a tired-looking woman played something melancholy on an out-of-tune piano. Florence felt eyes on her as she entered. A woman alone in such an establishment was bound to draw attention, but she kept her gaze forward, spotting the cowboy at the bar. He noticed her approach and nodded to the stool beside him. "Name's Hunter Bradley," he said simply. "Ranch foreman at the Double B, about 10 miles west of here." "Florence Delaney," she offered cautiously, still standing. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Delaney. Join me for some stew. On me." He indicated a steaming bowl the barkeep had just placed before him. Her pride wrestled with her hunger, but the latter won. "Thank you, Mr. Bradley." As she took the seat beside him, Hunter ordered another bowl. "New to Willow Creek?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. "Just arrived today," she confirmed, gratefully accepting the stew when it arrived. The first spoonful nearly brought tears to her eyes. It was hot and flavorful, everything she needed. "Got family here?" Florence tensed. "No," she said shortly, hoping he wouldn't pry further. Hunter seemed to sense her discomfort and changed the subject. "Nasty storm, crops need it though." Been a dry summer. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the clink of spoons against bowls and the distant piano notes. When Florence had nearly finished, she felt compelled to offer something in return for his kindness. "I'm looking for work," she said suddenly. "I can cook, clean, so. I've worked as a maid and in a millinery shop." Hunter considered her for a moment. "As it happens, Mrs. Whittaker over at the boarding house was saying just yesterday she needs help. Her arthritis is getting worse, and she can't keep up with the place anymore." He paused. "If you're planning to stay, that is." Florence looked down at her now empty bowl. "I haven't decided yet." The truth was, she had nowhere else to go. Her small savings would cover perhaps 2 nights at a boarding house, and then what? But Willow Creek seemed as good a place as any to try and build something. At least here, she'd found one person who'd shown her kindness without expecting anything in return. Hunter finished his stew and placed some coins on the counter. "Storm's letting up. I can walk you to the boarding house, introduce you to Mrs. Whittaker." Outside, the rain had indeed slowed to a gentle patter. The setting sun broke through the clouds, painting the wet boardwalks with golden light. As they walked, Florence stole glances at the man beside her. There was something reassuring about his presence, solid and undemanding. "So what brings you to Willow Creek, if you don't mind my asking?" Hunter inquired, careful to keep his tone conversational. Florence hesitated. "A fresh start," she finally said. It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't a lie either. "Seems to me that's what most folks are looking for out here," he replied with a nod. The boarding house was a 2-story structure with a wide porch and neat curtains in the windows. Mrs. Whitaker, a round woman with silver hair and quick eyes, answered the door at Hunter's knock. "Hunter Bradley, twice in 1 week. To what do I owe the pleasure?" she exclaimed, then noticed Florence standing behind him. "Mrs. Whitaker, this is Miss Florence Delaney. Just arrived in town and looking for work. Thought you two might be able to help each other out." The older woman's eyes lit up as she looked Florence over. "Can you cook, girl?" "Yes, madam, and clean and so." "Well now, that is fortunate. Come in, both of you. I've just put on tea." As Mrs. Whitaker bustled ahead of them into the house, Hunter turned to Florence. "She's a good woman, fair, you could do worse." "Thank you," Florence said, meeting his eyes directly for the first time. "For everything." He smiled then, a warm, genuine smile that transformed his weathered face. "My pleasure, Miss Delaney. Welcome to Willow Creek." 3 hours later, Florence found herself the new live-in help at Whitaker's boarding house, with a small but clean room of her own in the attic. Mrs. Whitaker had been more than fair, offering room and board plus a modest salary in exchange for Florence's help with cooking, cleaning, and looking after the handful of long-term, boarders mostly unmarried men who worked at the sawmill or as clerks in town. As she unpacked her meager belongings, Florence felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief at having secured a position so quickly, apprehension at staying in one place long enough for her past to catch up with her. But Willow Creek was small and remote. Perhaps here she could finally disappear. She moved to the window and looked out at the town, now bathed in moonlight after the storm. Somewhere out there, Hunter Bradley was probably riding back to his ranch. She wondered if she'd see him again and was surprised to find herself hoping she would. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the previous day's storm having washed everything clean. Florence was up before sunrise, eager to prove her worth to Mrs. Whitaker. By the time the boarders came down for breakfast, she had biscuits in the oven and coffee brewing on the stove. "My word, girl, you are a find," Mrs. Whitaker declared, watching Florence efficiently serve the morning meal. "Those biscuits are lighter than air." The first week passed in a blur of work and routine. Florence found herself settling in despite her initial reservations. Mrs. Whitaker was demanding but kind, and the boarders were respectful, if a bit curious about the new addition to the household. She deflected their questions with vague answers and a polite smile, and soon they seemed to accept her presence without further inquiry. On Saturday morning, Mrs. Whitaker handed Florence a list. "Need you to fetch these things from the general store. Mr. Peterson will put it on our account." Florence welcomed the opportunity to get out of the house. The late August sun warmed her shoulders as she made her way down the main street, nodding politely to those she passed. Willow Creek was slowly becoming familiar the mercantile, with its barrels of pickles out front, the blacksmith's forge ringing with the sound of hammer on anvil, the small church with its white steeple reaching toward the sky. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she nearly walked straight into Hunter Bradley emerging from the general store. "Miss Delaney," he said, tipping his hat. "Good to see you looking settled." "Mr. Bradley," she replied, surprised at how pleased she was to see him. "Yes, Mrs. Whitaker has been very kind. Glad to hear it." He shifted the package under his arm. "How are you finding Willow Creek?" "It's peaceful," she said, searching for the right word. "Different from what I'm used to." "And what might that be?" he asked, his eyes curious but not intrusive. Florence hesitated, old habits of caution warring with a desire to share something of herself with this man. "Cities, mostly. Philadelphia, most recently." Hunter nodded. "Quite a change, then. What made you come all this way west?" The question was innocent enough, but Florence felt the familiar panic rise in her chest. "I should get these supplies," she said, holding up the list. "Mrs. Whittaker is expecting me back." If Hunter was offended by her abrupt change of subject, he didn't show it. "Of course. Perhaps I'll see you at the social next weekend. Whole town turns out for it." Social, harvest dance, end of summer tradition around these parts. Good food, music, chance to meet your neighbors. Florence hadn't considered herself staying long enough to have neighbors, but she found herself nodding. "Perhaps. I'll look for you there then," Hunter said with a smile that made something flutter in her chest. He tipped his hat again and continued on his way, leaving Florence staring after him, list clutched in her hand. Inside the general store, Mr. Peterson greeted her warmly. "Mrs. Whittaker's new girl. How are you settling in, Miss Delaney?" "Very well, thank you," she replied, handing over the list. As he gathered the items, the shopkeeper kept up a steady stream of small talk. "Saw you speaking with Hunter Bradley. Fine man, Hunter. Been foreman at the Double B going on 5 years now. Owner, Mr. Buchanan, relies on him completely. Lives in San Francisco, most of the time, leaves everything to Hunter." Florence made noncommittal noises as Mr. Peterson continued his commentary on the local citizens, filing away the information about Hunter. A trusted foreman was a man of standing in a community like this. "He's not spoken for, you know," Mr. Peterson added with a wink as he handed over the package of supplies. Florence felt her cheeks warm. "I hardly know the man, Mr. Peterson." Of course," he replied, though his knowing smile remained, "just making conversation." By the time she returned to the boarding house, Florence had convinced herself that Hunter Bradley's interest in her was merely neighborly kindness to a newcomer. After all, what would a man like him established, respected want with someone like her, a woman with nothing to her name but secrets? Yet that night, as she lay in her narrow bed under the eaves, she found herself remembering the warmth in his eyes and wondering what it might be like to have someone to rely on, someone to trust. The thought was as frightening as it was alluring. The week leading up to the harvest social was busy at the boarding house. 2 new guests arrived, a land surveyor and his assistant, requiring Florence to prepare additional rooms and cook larger meals. Mrs. Whittaker was pleased with her work, and Florence found herself taking pride in the older woman's approval. "You'll be wanting Saturday evening off for the social," Mrs. Whittaker announced on Thursday as they washed dishes together. Florence hesitated. "I hadn't decided if I was going." Mrs. Whittaker gave her a shrewd look. "Girl like you should be out enjoying herself, not hiding away in an old woman's kitchen. Besides, I heard Hunter Bradley asking after you when he was in town yesterday." Florence nearly dropped the plate she was drying. "He was asking about me." "Wanted to know if you were settling in all right," Mrs. Whittaker confirmed with a knowing smile. "Man doesn't ride 10 miles just to check on a passing acquaintance." "I'm sure he had other business in town," Florence protested, though her heart had begun to beat faster. Was all Mrs. Whittaker said, but her expression spoke volumes. That evening, Florence took out the one good dress she owned, a simple blue cotton with white piping, and inspected it critically. It was somewhat out of fashion and showed signs of wear, but it was clean and neat. She spent an hour carefully mending a loose seam and pressing out the wrinkles. When Saturday evening arrived, Florence found herself standing before the small mirror in her room, pinning up her hair with trembling fingers. What was she doing? Getting dressed up for a man she barely knew, a man who couldn't possibly understand the complications she would bring into his life. Yet something drove her on, perhaps the simple human need for connection, or maybe just the desire for one evening of normalcy after so many months of fear and flight. Mrs. Whittaker whistled appreciatively when Florence came downstairs. "My, don't you clean up nice? That blue brings out your eyes." "Thank you," Florence replied, smoothing her skirt self-consciously. "Are you sure you'll be all right here alone?" "Pshaw. I managed this place for 15 years before you came along. Go on now, enjoy yourself. The social's at the Grange Hall, just past the church." The walk to the Grange Hall took only a few minutes, but Florence nearly turned back twice. The sound of fiddle music and laughter grew louder as she approached, and through the open doors, she could see lanterns illuminating a room full of people. Women in their best dresses, men with slicked-back hair and Sunday shirts, the entire town seemed to be there. Florence hesitated at the entrance, suddenly overwhelmed. She hadn't been in a crowd like this since that night in Philadelphia when everything had gone so terribly wrong. Miss Delaney. She turned to find Hunter standing behind her, looking more handsome than she remembered in a clean shirt and vest, his normally unruly hair tamed with pomade. "Mr. Bradley," she managed, trying to calm her racing heart. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "I'm glad you did." He offered her his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. Together they entered the hall, the warmth and noise enveloping them. Hunter guided her through the crowd, introducing her to people whose names Florence immediately forgot in her nervousness. "Punch?" he asked, and at her nod, he disappeared toward a table laden with refreshments. Left alone, Florence scanned the room, taking in the colorful bunting decorating the walls and the makeshift stage where 3 musicians played a lively tune. Couples were dancing in the center, their movements creating a swirl of color and motion. "Here you are," Hunter said, returning with 2 cups. "Fair warning, Mr. Finch always spikes the punch with his homemade apple brandy." Florence took a cautious sip and coughed as the strong liquid burned her throat. "I see what you mean," she gasped. Hunter laughed, a rich, deep sound that made Florence smile despite herself. "Takes getting used to," he admitted. "Finch is proud of his brew, though, so everyone pretends to enjoy it." They stood watching the dancers for a while, making small talk about the town and its inhabitants. Florence gradually relaxed, finding Hunter easy to talk to. He had a way of drawing her out without prying, telling stories about the ranch and the characters who worked there that had her laughing more than she had in months. When the musicians struck up a slower tune, Hunter set down his empty cup. "Would you care to dance, Miss Delaney?" Florence hesitated. It had been so long since she'd danced with anyone. "I'm afraid I'm out of practice," she admitted. "That makes 2 of us," he replied with a grin. "We can be clumsy together." Somehow, his self-deprecation made it impossible to refuse. Florence allowed him to lead her to the dance floor, where he placed one hand respectfully at her waist, the other clasping her fingers. Despite his claims of clumsiness, Hunter moved with surprising grace, guiding her through the simple steps with confidence. "You're not nearly as out of practice as you claimed," Florence accused lightly as they turned in time to the music. "Maybe I just have the right partner," he replied, his eyes holding hers. Florence felt her cheeks warm and looked away, unable to maintain the intensity of his gaze. They danced in silence for a moment, the simple pleasure of movement and music creating a bubble around them that shut out the rest of the room. "You know," Hunter said softly, "I've been wanting to ask you something since we met." Florence tensed slightly. Here it came the inevitable questions about her past, her family, why she was alone. "Yes," she managed, bracing herself. "Would you consider coming out to the Double B tomorrow? For dinner," he clarified quickly. "Sunday's my day off, and I make a decent venison stew. Thought you might enjoy seeing a bit of ranch life." It wasn't at all what she'd expected, and Florence found herself at a loss for words. That is Mrs. Whittaker. Already spoke to her," Hunter admitted with a slightly sheepish smile. "She said she could spare you for an afternoon." "You seem very sure of yourself, Mr. Bradley," Florence said, torn between amusement and irritation at his presumption. Hunter's smile faded. "I apologize if I've overstepped. It's just, I've enjoyed talking with you, getting to know you. Thought you might like to see more of the country than just the town." His sincerity was disarming, and Florence found her irritation melting away. "No, I'm sorry. That was ungracious of me. I would like to see your ranch if the invitation still stands." The smile returned to his face, brightening his eyes. "It does. I'll come by the boarding house around noon if that suits." "That would be fine," she agreed, a flutter of anticipation in her stomach. The music ended and couples around them began to separate, but Hunter kept hold of her hand. "Would you like to step outside for a bit? It's getting warm in here." The night air was cool and refreshing after the heat of the dance hall. Stars speckled the vast Montana sky, more than Florence had ever seen in the city. They walked to a bench situated under a large oak tree, its branches casting dappled shadows in the moonlight. "It's beautiful here," Florence said, looking up at the stars. "Different from Philadelphia," Hunter observed. "Very different." She hesitated, then added, "Better in many ways." "What brought you out here, Florence, if you don't mind my asking?" His voice was gentle, without pressure. Florence considered her answer carefully. Hunter deserved some truth, even if she couldn't give him the whole of it. "I was married," she began slowly. "Briefly, it ended badly." Hunter was silent, waiting for her to continue if she chose. "After that, I couldn't stay in Philadelphia. Too many memories, too many people who knew him. I needed somewhere new, somewhere I could start over." "And you chose Montana," Hunter said, a question in his voice. "I chose the furthest place I could afford to reach," Florence admitted with a small smile. "When the money ran out, here I was." Hunter nodded, seemingly satisfied with her partial explanation. "Well, I for one am glad your journey ended in Willow Creek." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the distant sounds of the social providing a backdrop to the night sounds, crickets chirping, an owl hooting somewhere in the darkness. "Florence," Hunter said finally, turning to face her. "I don't know what happened to you back east, and you don't have to tell me, but I want you to know that you're safe here. This town looks after its own." His words brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "I've never really had that," she whispered. "Safety, belonging." Hunter's hand found hers in the darkness. "I've never had a home," she confessed, the words escaping before she could stop them. "Not a real one, not somewhere I truly belonged." Hunter's fingers tightened around hers. "Then let me build you one in my arms," he said softly, the simple sincerity of his words stealing her breath. For a long moment they sat there, hands clasped, the promise of his words hanging in the air between them. Then, from inside the hall, the music swelled again, breaking the spell. "We should probably go back in," Florence said reluctantly. "People will talk," Hunter chuckled. "They're already talking. Small town, remember?" But he stood and offered her his arm, escorting her back to the brightness and noise of the social. They danced twice more before the evening ended, and Hunter walked her back to the boarding house, their conversation flowing easily now. At the door, he took her hand and raised it to his lips in a gesture that seemed both old-fashioned and perfectly natural. "Until tomorrow," he said, his voice warm in the darkness. "Tomorrow," Florence echoed, watching him walk away before entering the silent house, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The next morning, Florence was up early despite having been out late. She moved through her chores with unusual energy, earning a knowing look from Mrs. Whittaker. "That Hunter Bradley must be quite the dancer," the older woman commented as they prepared breakfast. Florence felt her cheeks grow warm. "He was very kind." "MMHMM, Mrs." Whittaker hummed, a smile playing at her lips, "and handsome to boot." "Mrs. Whittaker," Florence protested, though she couldn't suppress a smile of her own. "Just stating facts, dear. Now, you'll want to wear your blue dress again for your outing today. It suits you." By the time noon approached, Florence had changed into her blue dress, pinned her hair up neatly, and was waiting nervously in the front parlor. When a knock came at the door, she jumped to her feet, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. Hunter stood on the porch, hat in hand, looking as nervous as she felt. Behind him, a wagon with 2 horses waited at the curb. "Right on time," Mrs. Whittaker declared, appearing from the kitchen. "Have her back before dark, Mr. Bradley." "Yes, madam," Hunter replied with a grin. "Ready, Florence?" The use of her first name sent a little thrill through her. "Ready," she confirmed, accepting his hand as he helped her into the wagon. The journey to the Double B took about 45 minutes, during which Hunter pointed out landmarks and told stories about the area. Florence found herself relaxing in his company, drawn in by his obvious love for the land and his straightforward manner. The ranch itself was impressive, a large main house, bunkhouse, stables, and various outbuildings spread across a valley with mountains rising in the distance. Cattle grazed on the hillsides, and cowboys on horseback moved among them, tiny figures in the vast landscape. "It's beautiful," Florence said as they approached. "Home," Hunter replied simply. "Been here since '78, came out as a regular hand, worked my way up to foreman." He helped her down from the wagon and led her to the main house, a solid 2-story structure with a wide porch wrapping around it. Inside, the furnishings were simple but good quality leather chairs, a large oak table, bookshelves lining one wall. "This is all yours?" Florence asked, taking in the spaciousness of the place. "As foreman, I get the run of the main house when the boss isn't here, which is most of the time," Hunter explained. "Buchanan's got business interests in San Francisco, comes out maybe twice a year to check on things." He showed her around the downstairs, the study where he kept the ranch accounts, the dining room rarely used except when Buchanan entertained, the large kitchen where he'd already started his promised stew. "It needs to simmer a while longer," he said, checking the pot on the stove. "Thought you might like to see a bit of the ranch while we wait." Outside, Hunter saddled 2 horses, a gentle mare for Florence and his own stallion, a magnificent bay. "Ever ridden before?" he asked as he helped her mount. "Not since I was a girl," she admitted, adjusting her skirts as best she could and taking the reins he offered. "Daisy here will take good care of you," he assured her, patting the mare's neck. "Just follow my lead." They rode at a leisurely pace, following a creek that wound through the property. Hunter pointed out features of the landscape and explained the workings of the ranch, how they rotated grazing areas, prepared for winter, managed the spring calving. Florence listened, fascinated by this world so different from anything she'd known. At a particularly beautiful spot where the creek widened into a small pool, they dismounted. Hunter spread a blanket on the grass, and they sat watching the water flow past, the horses grazing nearby. "I can see why you love it here," Florence said, taking in the peaceful scene. "It feels separate from the rest of the world." Hunter nodded. "That's what drew me west in the first place, space to breathe, to be your own man." He glanced at her. "Or woman." Florence smiled, appreciating his understanding. "Yes, exactly. Were you always in Philadelphia?" he asked, breaking off a stem of grass and twirling it between his fingers. "No, I grew up in Boston, in an orphanage," she added, deciding to offer this piece of her past. "My mother died when I was 6, never knew my father." Hunter's expression was sympathetic but not pitying, which she appreciated. "Must have been hard." "It was, lonely," Florence acknowledged, "but I learned to take care of myself." "And then you married," Hunter prompted gently. Florence tensed, then deliberately relaxed her shoulders. "Yes." "Frederick Harding. He was charming, attentive. I thought I'd finally found someone who saw me, who cared." She paused, the memories still painful despite the distance of time and space. "I was wrong." Hunter waited, his silence an invitation to continue if she wished. "He was cruel," she said finally. "Not at first. At first he was everything I'd dreamed of, but after the wedding he changed, or perhaps he just showed his true self." "Did he hurt you?" Hunter asked, his voice tight. Florence nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Hunter's jaw clenched, but when he spoke, his voice was controlled. "Is he why you ran? Are you afraid he'll find you?" The directness of the question startled her. "No," she said quickly. "Frederick is dead." As soon as the words left her mouth, Florence regretted them. She'd said too much, revealed too much. Hunter would ask how Frederick died, and then what would she tell him? But Hunter surprised her. "Good," he said simply. "Saved someone the trouble of killing him." The bluntness of his response startled a laugh from her, breaking the tension. "It's not quite as dramatic as all that," she said, relieved at his reaction. "He was thrown from a horse, broke his neck. It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't entirely a lie either. Frederick had indeed died from a broken neck, though the circumstances had been more complicated than a simple riding accident. "I'm sorry for what you went through," Hunter said, his eyes holding hers. "But I'm not sorry he's gone, if that's what allowed you to find your way here." The simple honesty of his words touched her deeply. "Neither am I," she admitted. "Is that terrible of me?" "No," Hunter replied. "It's human." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the gentle sound of the creek filling the space between them. Florence felt oddly lightened, having shared even this small part of her past with someone who seemed to understand without judgment. Eventually, they returned to the house, where Hunter's stew had simmered to perfection. They ate at the kitchen table rather than in the formal dining room, fresh bread from town complementing the rich venison and vegetables. "This is delicious," Florence said, genuinely impressed. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "My mother," Hunter replied, breaking off a piece of bread. "Before she died, she made sure I could fend for myself. Said no son of hers was going to live on beans and bacon like most cowboys. She sounds like a wise woman." She was. His expression grew distant for a moment. "Lost her and my father both to influenza when I was 16. That's when I headed west. Nothing left for me in Ohio." "I'm sorry," Florence said softly, understanding all too well the pain of being left alone in the world. Hunter shrugged, though his eyes remained sad. "Long time ago now, but I still use her recipes." After dinner, they moved to the porch, where they sat in rocking chairs watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. The ranch hands were returning from their day's work, leading tired horses toward the stables, their voices carrying faintly on the evening air. "Thank you for today," Florence said as darkness began to fall. "I've enjoyed it very much." "I'm glad," Hunter replied. He hesitated, then added, "I'd like to see you again, Florence, regularly if you're amenable." The formal phrasing made her smile. "Are you courting me, Mr. Bradley?" "I believe I am, Miss Delaney," he answered, his expression serious despite the lightness of their tone. "If you'll allow it." Florence considered his words. She'd come to Willow Creek to hide, to escape her past. Getting involved with someone, especially someone as straightforward and honest as Hunter, hadn't been part of her plan. It would mean continuing to conceal certain truths, or risking everything by revealing them. Yet as she looked at him in the fading light, his face open and hopeful, she found herself unwilling to turn away from the possibility he represented. "I think I would like that," she said finally. The smile that spread across his face was worth any risk. True to his word, Hunter began courting Florence properly. He came to town twice a week, sometimes taking her for drives in the countryside, other times simply walking with her through Willow Creek or sitting on the boarding house porch after dinner. Mrs. Whitaker, thoroughly approving of the match, always made herself scarce during these visits, though Florence often caught her watching them with a satisfied smile. September gave way to October, and the mountains surrounding Willow Creek blazed with autumn colors. Florence settled more deeply into her life at the boarding house, taking on additional responsibilities as Mrs. Whitaker's arthritis worsened with the changing weather. The work was demanding but satisfying, and for the first time in her life, Florence felt she was truly earning her place rather than simply surviving. Hunter, true to his promise, never pressed her for more details about her past than she volunteered. Their conversations ranged widely: books they'd read, places they'd seen, hopes for the future. Florence found herself opening up more with each meeting, sharing small pieces of herself that she'd kept hidden for so long. On a particularly fine Sunday in mid-October, Hunter suggested a picnic. "The cottonwoods along the river are at their peak," he explained. "Won't be many more days this warm before winter sets in." They rode out from the ranch on horseback, Florence now comfortable enough on Daisy to enjoy the journey. Hunter led them to a spot where the river widened, forming a gentle pool surrounded by golden cottonwoods, their leaves shimmering in the sunlight. After they'd eaten the lunch misses. Whitaker had packed fried chicken, biscuits, and apple pie. They walked along the riverbank, collecting particularly beautiful leaves. The air was crisp, but the sun warm on their faces, creating a perfect balance that Florence wished could last forever. "I've been thinking," Hunter said as they sat on a fallen log, watching the river flow past. "Winter's coming. Roads will be bad, might be snowed in for weeks at a time." "Mrs. Whitaker says the winters here are harsh," Florence agreed, wondering where he was going with this observation. "They are. Makes it hard to come to town regularly." He turned to face her, taking her hands in his. "Florence, I care for you, more than I thought possible in such a short time. These past weeks have been the happiest I can remember." Florence's heart began to race. "I care for you too, Hunter." "I'm glad," he said with a smile that quickly turned serious again. "Because I need to ask you something important, something that might seem sudden but feels right to me." He slid from the log to one knee before her, still holding her hands. "Florence Delaney, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Though she'd begun to suspect where the conversation was heading, the actual proposal still took her breath away. "Hunter, I know it hasn't been long," he hurried on, "and I know there are things in your past you're not ready to share, but I love who you are now, the woman I've come to know. I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." Florence felt tears well in her eyes. The sincerity in his face, the openness of his affection, it was everything she'd ever wanted and never believed she deserved. "Before you answer," he continued, "you should know what I'm offering. Life on a ranch isn't easy, especially for a woman. It's isolated, the work is hard, and luxuries are few. But I promise to work every day to make you happy, to give you the home you've never had." His words echoed their conversation at the social, reminding her of his promise to build her a home in his arms. The memory, combined with the earnestness of his proposal, broke through the last of her hesitation. "Yes," she said, squeezing his hands. "Yes, I'll marry you." Hunter's face lit up with joy, and he rose to pull her into his arms. His kiss was gentle at first, then deepening as she responded, her arms going around his neck. When they finally parted, both were breathless. "I love you, Florence," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "And I love you," she replied, realizing as she said it how completely true it was. Somehow, in the span of just a few weeks, this man had become essential to her happiness. They sat together on the log, hands entwined, making plans. Hunter suggested a December wedding before the worst of winter set in. "Nothing fancy," he assured her. "Just us, the preacher, and whoever you'd like to invite. Mrs. Whitaker, of course," Florence said immediately. "She's been so kind to me." "And some of the ranch hands," Hunter added. "They're like family to me." The simplicity of it all appealed to Florence, who had no desire for the kind of elaborate society wedding Frederick had insisted upon. This would be real, honest like Hunter himself. As they rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon light, Florence felt a contentment she'd never known before. Yet beneath it lay a sliver of anxiety. Marriage meant no more secrets, no more half-truths. Before she became Hunter's wife, she would have to tell him the whole story about Frederick, about what had really happened that night in Philadelphia. She pushed the thought away, unwilling to let it dampen her happiness. There would be time for truth-telling later. For now, she wanted to savor the joy of being loved, of having found, against all odds, a man who saw her worth. News of their engagement spread quickly through Willow Creek. Mrs. Whitaker was overjoyed, hugging Florence tightly when she shared the news. "I knew it the moment I saw you two together," she declared. "Just knew it." The other boarders offered congratulations, as did the townspeople Florence had come to know in her months there. Mr. Peterson at the general store insisted on giving her a length of cream-colored silk for a proper wedding dress, refusing payment despite her protests. Hunter came to town more frequently now, often staying for dinner at the boarding house and spending the evening with Florence in the parlor under Mrs. Whitaker's discreet chaperonage. They discussed plans for their life together, how they would arrange the main house at the Double B. what animals Florence might like to raise, books they would read together during the long winter evenings. But as their December wedding date approached, Florence's anxiety grew. The happiness she'd found felt precarious, built as it was on a foundation that included certain omissions about her past. Each time she resolved to tell Hunter the full truth about Frederick's death, something held her back, fear of losing his respect, his love, the future they were planning. One evening in late November, as they sat together on the boarding house porch despite the chill in the air, Florence finally gathered her courage. "Hunter, there's something I need to tell you," she began, her heart pounding. "About Frederick, about how he died." Hunter turned to her, his expression serious but open. "I'm listening." Florence took a deep breath. "It wasn't exactly as I said before. He didn't just fall from a horse." She twisted her hands in her lap. "The night he died, he'd been drinking heavily. When he came home, he was in a rage over some business deal gone wrong." Hunter remained silent, watching her face. "He'd hit me before many times, but that night was different. Worse, I tried to get away, to lock myself in the bedroom, but he caught me on the stairs." Florence's voice faltered as the memories washed over her. "He was dragging me back down, his hands around my throat. I couldn't breathe. I thought he might actually kill me this time." "Florence," Hunter said softly, reaching for her hand. She clutched his fingers like a lifeline. "I fought back. Harder than I ever had before. We struggled, and then he fell down the stairs, his neck." She swallowed hard. "The doctor said it was broken instantly, that he felt nothing." "You defended yourself," Hunter said, his voice steady. "Any court would call it self-defense." "There was no court," Florence whispered. "His family, they were influential, wealthy. They made it clear that if there was any scandal, they would make sure I was blamed, charged with murder." She looked up at him, desperately searching his face for judgment. "So I ran. Took what little money I had and headed west, and I've been running ever since, until I reached Willow Creek." Hunter was quiet for a long moment, processing her words. Then he squeezed her hand gently. "Thank you for telling me. It can't have been easy to carry that alone all this time." "You're not disgusted, afraid of what I did?" "Disgusted?" Hunter looked genuinely confused. "Florence, you protected yourself from a man who was trying to kill you. There's nothing shameful in that." "But I took a life," she insisted, needing him to understand the weight she carried. "And I've taken lives too," Hunter replied quietly. "In the war, and once when the ranch was raided by cattle rustlers. Taking a life is never easy, never something to be done lightly. But sometimes it's necessary to preserve your own." His understanding, so complete and immediate, broke something open inside Florence. Tears that she'd held back for so long finally spilled over, and Hunter pulled her into his arms, holding her as she cried. "You're safe now," he murmured against her hair. "No one from Philadelphia is going to find you here, and if they did, they'd have to go through me first." When her tears finally subsided, Florence pulled back to look at him. "You still want to marry me, knowing everything?" Hunter's eyes were solemn as they met hers. "More than ever," he said firmly. "You're the strongest, bravest woman I know, Florence Delaney, and in 2 weeks, I'll be proud to call you my wife." Their wedding day dawned clear and cold, the December sun casting long shadows across the fresh snow that had fallen overnight. Florence stood at the window of her attic room, watching the light change from gray to gold as morning broke over Willow Creek. Today, she would become Mrs. Hunter Bradley. The thought still seemed miraculous, a dream she might wake from at any moment. Yet the cream silk dress hanging on the door was real enough, as was the small bouquet of dried flowers and evergreens Mrs. Whittaker had arranged for her. A knock at her door preceded Mrs. Whittaker herself, already dressed in her Sunday best, her silver hair arranged more elaborately than usual. "Ready, my dear?" she asked, her eyes suspiciously bright. "The church will be waiting." Mrs. Whittaker had insisted on hosting a small breakfast after the ceremony, and several of the boarders had volunteered to help prepare while she accompanied Florence to the church. Hunter would be waiting there with Reverend Thompson and whatever friends from the ranch had been able to make the journey into town. "Almost," Florence replied, turning from the window. "Would you help me with my dress?" as Mrs. Whitaker fastened the row of tiny buttons down her back. Florence found herself thinking of her mother, what little she remembered of her. Would she be proud of the woman her daughter had become, of the choices she'd made? Florence liked to think so. "There, Mrs. Whitaker said, finishing the last button. "Let me look at you." Florence turned, the silk rustling softly. The dress was simple but elegant, with a modestly scooped neckline and sleeves that tapered to points at her wrists. Her hair was pinned up in a style Mrs. Whitaker had helped her practice, with a few soft curls framing her face. "Oh, my dear girl," Mrs. Whitaker said, her eyes definitely wet now. "You're beautiful. Hunter Bradley is a fortunate man indeed." "I'm the fortunate one," Florence replied, embracing the older woman who had become like family to her. "Thank you for everything." Mrs. Whitaker sniffed and dabbed at her eyes. "None of that now, or we'll both be a mess. Come along, your groom is waiting." The small church was warm and bright with candles when they arrived, the scent of pine boughs decorating the altar mingling with wood smoke from the stove. Only a dozen or so people were present, the boarding house residents, Mr. Peterson and his wife, a few other townspeople Florence had come to know, and 4 men from the Double B whom Hunter had introduced as his closest friends among the ranch hands. And there was Hunter himself, standing at the altar beside Reverend Thompson, looking more handsome than Florence had ever seen him in a new black suit, his hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. When he saw her enter, his expression of awe and love nearly stopped her heart. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful. They had chosen traditional vows, the familiar words taking on new significance as they promised to love, honor, and cherish one another until death parted them. When Hunter slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, one that had belonged to his mother, he told her Florence felt the last pieces of her old life fall away, replaced by the promise of something new and precious. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Thompson declared. "You may kiss your bride." Hunter's kiss was gentle, but possessed a certainty that spoke of all the kisses to come, a lifetime of them, shared in both joy and sorrow, in sickness and in health, just as they had vowed. The breakfast at the boarding house was a merry affair, with Mrs. Whitaker outdoing herself despite her arthritis. The table groaned under platters of eggs, bacon, sausages, biscuits, and hot cakes, with syrup and preserves to accompany them. Everyone ate heartily, offering toasts to the newlyweds and good-natured advice about married life. Afterward, Hunter and Florence departed for the Double B in the wagon he'd driven to town, now decorated with ribbons and bells by his mischievous ranch hands. They had decided to spend their wedding night and the first weeks of their marriage at the ranch, before undertaking a brief honeymoon to Helena in the spring, when travel would be easier. As they drove away from Willow Creek, the sound of the bells jingling in the crisp air, Florence leaned against Hunter's shoulder, a contentment so deep it was almost pain filling her chest. "Happy, Mrs. Bradley?" Hunter asked, his arm tightening around her. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied honestly. "Welcome home, then," he said as they crested a hill, and the Double B came into view, smoke rising from the chimney of the main house, a wreath hanging on the door in honor of both the season and their marriage. Home. The word had never held meaning for Florence before, had been nothing but an abstract concept, a dream always out of reach. Yet here it was, offered freely by the man beside her, not just a house, but a place of belonging, of safety, of love. "Home," she echoed, the word a promise and a prayer. The next morning, Florence woke to find Hunter watching her, his expression tender in the early light filtering through the bedroom curtains. "Good morning, wife," he said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Good morning, husband," she replied, the new title still strange but wonderful on her tongue. They lay together in the quiet of the room, listening to the sounds of the ranch coming to life outside, horses nickering in the stables, men's voices calling to one another as they began their day's work. "What would you like to do today?" Hunter asked, his fingers tracing patterns on her shoulder. "We have the house to ourselves. The men know not to disturb us unless it's an emergency." Florence considered the question. "Show me everything," she said finally. "All the places that are special to you here. I want to know this land the way you do." Hunter's smile was worth any discomfort the day's riding might bring. "I'd like that." After a leisurely breakfast, their first meal together, as husband and wife in their own home, they saddled the horses and set out across the ranch. Hunter showed her his favorite spots. The ridge where he often watched the sunrise, the hidden valley where wildflowers bloomed in profusion each spring, the ancient pine where he'd built a small shelter during his first year at the Double B. "I used to come here to think," he explained as they sat inside the crude but sturdy structure, protected from the winter wind. "When I was still finding my way, figuring out who I wanted to be out here." "And who did you decide that was?" Florence asked, genuinely curious about the path that had led him to become the man she loved. Hunter considered the question seriously. "Someone honest," he said finally. "Someone who keeps his word, who treats others fairly, who works hard and doesn't complain when things get difficult." He glanced at her. "Simple things, maybe, but they matter out here." "They matter everywhere," Florence replied, thinking of all the men she'd known who had failed at those simple things, her husband foremost among them. They returned to the house as dusk was falling, cold but exhilarated from their day outdoors. Hunter built up the fire in the main room while Florence prepared a simple supper from the supplies Mrs. Whittaker had sent with them. That night, as they lay together in the darkness of their bedroom, Florence found herself thinking of the journey that had brought her to this place, this man, this life. The pain and fear that had driven her west seemed distant now, like a story that had happened to someone else. "What are you thinking about?" Hunter asked, his voice drowsy in the darkness. "How strange life is," she replied, nestling closer to his warmth. "How the worst thing that ever happened to me led me to the best thing." Hunter's arms tightened around her. "I'm glad you found your way here, to me." "So am I," Florence whispered, closing her eyes and letting sleep take her, safe in the knowledge that she was, at long last, home. The winter of 1883-1884 was one of the harshest in memory, with snowstorms that buried the ranch in drifts taller than a man and temperatures that froze water buckets solid within minutes of being brought inside. Yet for Florence and Hunter, it was a time of profound happiness. Cut off from town for weeks at a time, they settled into a rhythm of life together. Hunter went out each day to work with the men, ensuring the cattle survived the brutal weather, while Florence made the main house truly theirs, rearranging furniture, hanging curtains she'd sewn herself, filling the bookshelves with volumes ordered from a catalog before the snow had closed the roads. In the evenings, they would sit before the fire, sometimes reading aloud to each other, sometimes simply talking, learning the 1,000 small details that made up each other's lives. Hunter told her about his childhood in Ohio, his parents' small farm, his brief time fighting in the final year of the Civil War, though he'd been barely 17. Florence shared memories of her mother, of the kindly matron at the orphanage who had taught her to read, of the beauty she'd found in Philadelphia despite the hardships of her life there. As winter slowly gave way to spring, Florence discovered she was with child. The knowledge filled her with both joy and trepidation, joy at creating this new life with Hunter, fear at the prospect of bringing a child into the world so far from doctors and modern conveniences. Hunter's reaction, when she told him, banished her fears. His face lit with such wonder, such pure happiness that Florence felt tears spring to her eyes. "A baby," he said, his voice hushed with awe. "Our baby." Then he was on his knees before her, his ear pressed to her still flat stomach. "Hello in there, little one. Your ma and pa are waiting for you." The simple tenderness of the gesture broke Florence's heart open even further, making room for this new love that was already growing alongside the child within her. Their planned trip to Helena was postponed in light of the pregnancy, but neither minded. Spring brought its own delights as the ranch burst into life after the long winter calves being born, wildflowers carpeting the hillsides, the creek running high with snowmelt. Florence took to ranch life with a determination that impressed even the most seasoned hands. She learned to make soap from tallow, to preserve the vegetables from the kitchen garden she'd planted, to identify the herbs that grew wild in the hills and use them for both cooking and simple remedies. When her pregnancy advanced to the point where riding became uncomfortable, she took over more of the household management, freeing Hunter to focus on the increasing demands of the ranch as summer approached. In late July, with the baby due in just over a month, Hunter hired a woman from town to help with the heavier work and to be on hand when Florence's time came. Hannah Wilson was a widow in her 50s who had delivered countless babies in Willow Creek and the surrounding area. Her practical, no-nonsense approach put Florence at ease, and her presence in the house was a comfort during the long days when Hunter was out on the range. "You're doing fine," Hannah assured her during one of the regular examinations she insisted upon. "Baby's positioned right, good and strong from the sounds of it. First ones often come a bit early, though, so we'll be ready." As it happened, the baby was punctual rather than early. On the morning of September 2, 1884, exactly 1 year after Florence had arrived in Willow Creek, her water broke as she was preparing breakfast. "Well now," Hannah said calmly when Florence called for her, "looks like today's the day. Let's get you comfortable." Hunter, already dressed to go out with the men, took one look at the situation and promptly canceled his plans. "I'll be right here," he told Florence, his face a mixture of excitement and concern. "Whatever you need." "What I need," Florence said through gritted teeth as the first real contraction hit, "is for you to stop looking so terrified. Hannah says everything is normal." Hannah chuckled as she helped Florence to the bedroom. "She's right, Mr. Bradley. First babies take their time. Go make yourself useful, boil some water. Fetch clean linens. We'll call when there's news." The labor lasted through the day and into the evening, Florence alternating between walking the bedroom floor with Hannah's support and resting on the bed through the increasingly intense contractions. Hunter checked on them hourly, bringing water, food for Hannah, fresh linens as needed, his face growing more anxious each time. "Men," Hannah muttered after he'd left following one such visit. "Always think they're in charge until something like this comes along to remind them who really runs the world." The comment startled a laugh from Florence despite her discomfort, and Hannah nodded approvingly. "That's it. Keep your spirits up. Baby's coming along fine, just taking the scenic route." Finally, as midnight approached, Hannah announced it was time to push. Hunter, summoned at last to his wife's side, held Florence's hand through the final, most painful part of the journey, murmuring encouragement and love as she fought to bring their child into the world. At 12 minutes past midnight on September 3, 1884, Henry James Bradley announced his arrival with a lusty cry that brought tears to both his parents' eyes. "A son," Hunter whispered as Hannah placed the squalling, red-faced infant on Florence's chest. "Florence, you've given us a son." Florence couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the perfect weight of this new life against her skin, by the fierce surge of love that washed through her at the sight of his tiny face, by the knowledge that she had created this miracle with the man she loved. "He's beautiful," she finally managed, looking up at Hunter through tears. "Like his mother," Hunter replied, his own voice choked with emotion as he gently touched their son's small hand. Hannah bustled around them, efficiently dealing with the afterbirth and cleaning up, but Florence barely noticed. Her world had narrowed to the small, warm bundle in her arms and the man beside her, the three of them forming a new constellation in the universe. Later, after Hannah had helped her wash and change into a fresh nightgown, after Henry had been swaddled and had taken his first meal at her breast, After Hunter had finally been persuaded to get some rest himself in the chair beside the bed, Florence lay awake in the pre-dawn darkness, listening to the soft breathing of her husband and son. She thought of the frightened, desperate woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Willow Creek a year ago, with nothing but a bag of meager possessions and a heart full of fear. How could she have imagined, then, the journey that awaited her? The love she would find, the family she would build, the peace she would know. "I've never had a home," she had confessed to Hunter that night at the social, revealing a wound so deep she'd thought it would never heal. "Then let me build you one in my arms," he had promised, and against all odds, he had kept that promise. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the curtains, Florence Bradley closed her eyes, her son nestled against her heart, her husband's hand resting protectively on them both, and knew with absolute certainty that she was, at last and forever, home. In the years that followed, the Bradley family thrived along with the Double B Ranch. Henry grew from a curious infant into a sturdy toddler with his father's eyes and his mother's determined spirit. When he was 3, a sister joined the family, Margaret Rose, named for both grandmothers neither child would ever meet, but whose legacy lived on in the love their parents shared. Florence became known throughout the region for her hospitality, her garden, and her quiet strength. The main house of the Double B was always open to travelers, neighboring ranchers, and the occasional party from the East come to experience the Wild West. Many were surprised to find such refinement and comfort so far from civilization, not realizing that true civilization had nothing to do with city streets and everything to do with the human heart. Hunter continued as foreman of the Double B until 1890, when Mr. Buchanan, impressed by the ranch's prosperity under his management, offered to sell him a partnership. By then, Florence had established a small side business selling preserves, honey from the hives she kept, and medicinal preparations made from herbs she grew and gathered. Their combined savings, along with a loan from the bank in Willow Creek, now much expanded from the tiny settlement Florence had first encountered, made the purchase possible. Mrs. Whittaker remained a dear friend until her passing in 1891, leaving the boarding house to Florence in her will. Rather than sell it, the Bradleys hired a manager to run the establishment, ensuring it remained a place of welcome for newcomers to Willow Creek, just as it had been for Florence herself. By the turn of the century, with both children away at school in Helena opportunities neither Florence nor Hunter had enjoyed in their own youth, the couple found themselves with time to reflect on the journey they had shared. "Did you ever imagine this life?" Hunter asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. "When you were running from Philadelphia, did you ever think you'd end up here?" Florence leaned against his shoulder, his arm automatically going around her, though they'd been married for 17 years. "Never," she admitted. "I was just trying to survive each day. The future was unimaginable." "And now," he prompted, his voice soft in the gathering dusk. "Now I can't imagine any other life," she replied, turning to meet his gaze. "Or any other man to share it with." Hunter's smile was as warm as it had been the day they met, his love as steady as the mountains that surrounded their home. "I told you I'd build you a home in my arms," he reminded her. "Best promise I ever kept." "The only promise that ever mattered," Florence agreed, settling back against him as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Home, indeed.